Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Hey Paul. This week I've got a question from Rick. Rick asks, Hey Paul, I'm interested in making multiples of pieces that I've sculpted, but I don't know where to start. Any help? It's a great question, Rick, and the answer is yes, I can help. What you're talking about is the process of mold making. The process of mold making that we're going to be discussing today is something called a block mold. It is the most basic of molds that you can get, and it'll end up looking something like this for the piece that I'm casting. As you can see, it's in the shape of a giant block. This is one of the easiest pieces that we can make. It's a great start, beginner piece for people who are new to the mold making process. A few of the materials that we're going to need to create a mold will be a board of some sort. I happen to be using foam core here, and that's going to be used to create the base that the master is going to sit on, as well as the walls that we'll create around it. It just needs to be sturdy enough that you can create a watertight seal around it. Something else that we're going to use is a little bit of tape. We've got hot glue. We'll need a blade, a pencil, we have a ruler, as well as some mold release, some gloves and a stir stick, the casting material, and a scale so that we can measure it out. A quick note about working with liquid silicone rubber. When you're creating molds using liquid silicone, you want to make sure that you do not get it onto your skin. It can be toxic, so you want to make sure that you take the proper precautions to make sure that you are safe. And one of those would be wearing gloves and eye protection. But you need to make sure that the gloves that you use are latex free. Ideally, you'd want to use nitrile or vinyl gloves, and that is because latex can cause cure inhibition with the silicone rubber. And what that means is that the silicone will not fully cure, and it can potentially ruin the master sculpt that you have, because once it gets on there, it's really difficult to remove. So when you're using gloves, make sure that you use either nitrile or vinyl. Okay, the first thing that we're going to want to do is attach the positive to the board, and we want this centered. Around the outer edges, we're going to want at least 3/4 of an inch around each of the walls, and that's going to allow the material to have enough thickness so that it won't bow out, because you want it to stay as rigid as possible when you have the silicone, because the silicone is flexible, so we want to make sure that it's rigid enough that it doesn't bow out onto the sides. So we need to make sure that the board that we're using around the outside is at least 3/4 of an inch wide on all sides. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use some hot glue and apply that to our model and center that as best we can. Now what we're going to do is we're going to measure out our walls. You want the height of the walls to come just above, again, about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch above the height of your piece that you are casting. Okay, any lower than that and you're not going to have enough material. So now what we need to do is measure and cut our walls and attach. So this doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, just close enough that we can create the pieces to make it as watertight as possible. So we're going to take our blade here, cut that. It's going to give us one of our sides. So we can go ahead and glue that side down. Now we're going to use our tape to tape all the edges to make sure that they're also watertight. This will just help prevent any of the extra silicone or any silicone that may leak from the edges from coming out and spilling onto the desk. It's just a preventative measure to ensure that we don't have any spillage. Now that we've got the edges locked in and watertight, we want to apply a mold release to the inside of this. So we're going to use mold release inside here. So we wanted to let it sit for 5 minutes. So while you're waiting for that to happen, we can get our mold making materials together. So we have a scale, and we have our material, and we have our instructions. When working with mold rubber, make sure that you read the instructions thoroughly. It gives you vital information on making sure that your molds turn out correctly. It'll tell you things like whether or not it needs to be mixed by volume or by weight. It'll tell you your pot life, which is the length of time you have to work with the material before it starts to set up, as well as your cure time, which is not the pot life. The cure time is the length of time it needs before the material is completely hardened. Okay, now that we have the material, we're going to take an empty bucket. This one happens to have measurements on the side, but that doesn't really matter. And then we have our scale here. You want to turn on your scale and you want to zero it out. Okay, that is called tearing. So we can see now that it is 0. If I remove the bucket, you can see that the bucket weighs 3 ounces. Put the bucket back onto it and it goes back to 0. Then we want to use the amount of material here and put in an equal amount by weight of A plus B. Now you can use this in either pounds or in grams. It doesn't matter, just as long as it's similar on both of them. So now we're going to add in our material, 250, and it is a 1-to-1 ratio. I can see 1-to-1 by volume or by weight. Okay. We're going to zero it out. You want to use a stir stick. I like to use these chopsticks. And we want to stir it completely. Now the key with stirring is to make sure you scrape the sides while you're stirring it. You want to get it as mixed as thoroughly as possible. This one has a 6-minute pot life, which means that we have to stir it pretty quickly to make sure that we get all the materials in there. You want to scrape the bottom as well as the sides as best you can to make sure you get a really nice, consistent mix with it. You don't want to over whip it because you don't want to add too much air into it, but you want to make sure that you get all of the sides scraped. A good way to tell is by looking at the bottom of the container to see if you have any areas that need to be mixed thoroughly. Once it's thoroughly mixed, you can go ahead and pour it. When you're pouring material into the mold box, you want to pour it from a height of about 2 feet so that you get what's called a ribbon pour. And that's going to help to pop any of the excess bubbles that are inside of the mold. So here we are. We're going to pour the material slowly from a height to create a ribbon pour. And you want to pour into the lowest spot on the mold and let it naturally fill the area. Okay, after the approved amount of time, we have a finished mold here. It is solid as a rock. Right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to actually demold the piece. The demolding process is fairly straightforward. But to demold it, what you want to do is you just want to slowly start to peel the material away from the edge, as you can see there. There. Now you'll get little thin parts like this. It's okay just to go ahead and break that. If it's thick, you want to cut it away, but if it's thin, it shouldn't be that big of a deal to just pull it away. Then we can remove our positive, and that's going to leave us with the negative to be able to cast our pieces. Now these edges here that you see here that they're a little bit rough, you can go in here and clean that up with a pair of scissors, really sharp scissors or a blade, and that will clean it up. Another thing that I like to do is on the back side of the mold, you'll get these little bits here, these little thinner edges that kind of ran up the sides of the piece. So what I'll do for that is I'll actually take a blade and we'll cut those corners off. Be careful not to cut yourself. And just kind of clean up those edges, and that's going to allow the mold to sit flat on the table when you flip it over to pour the casting material, because you're getting rid of that little raised edge that's in there. Just make sure you don't cut so much off that you interfere with the model on the inside. But as you can see now, it sits nice and flat. And there we have it. That's how we make a box mold. This is, again, the simplest mold that we can make. It's just about following the instructions, making sure that you mix it thoroughly, and that you create a box to hold the liquid material before it sets up that is watertight. Thanks for listening. If you guys have any other questions, you can contact me at heypaul@paulpapedesigns.com, or you can watch me at twitch.tv/paulpapedesigns, where I can interact with you live and answer any questions that you might have on the air. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.